It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. We really want to welcome you to the first presentation in our All About Alzheimer's monthly series, where we hope to bring you useful information that you can take back to your respite and support groups, or for those of you who might be caregivers, useful information that you can use in your care for your loved one, for those you might be taking care of. It really is a joy for me to be here today. Again, my name is Joan Asseff. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I've spent most of my career working with older adults in a wide array of settings, such as skilled nursing facilities. I was a director of social services for about 10 years in two fairly large facilities here in Austin. I've also worked in hospice, home health, and psychiatric care for older adults in an inpatient setting, and then also individual clinical practice as well. So I am a gerontologist through and through. This really is my passion. And as Claire mentioned, I now teach at the Steve Hicks School of Social Work, where I specifically spend some of my time teaching students who are focused on working with older adults. And that's through our GRACE program, which stands for Gerontology Resources and the Aging Community in Education. It's a really long name, but we specifically focus on placing master students in agencies where they learn how to work with older adults. So that's a little bit about me. I have worked intensively and extensively with patients and families and caregivers who have faced and are facing Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. I want to recognize the selfless and painstaking work you do in various ways to support those impacted by this disease, especially during this pandemic. So I'm honored and humbled to be here with you today. And I want to encourage your participation. I know we're recording the session, but we will make time at the end for questions. Feel free to drop questions in the chat, and we'll definitely get to those, and just sharing your experiences as well. I mean, we really want to hear from you and hear what would help you in your journey. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. And Claire, you may be, I guess, turning it on to full screen at this point. Is that possible, or let's see.
Yes, it should be.
Is it already there? Did everybody see? Okay, all right, great. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. So just a quick note about Alzheimer's Texas before we get into our material today. As I'm sure many of you know, Alzheimer's Texas is an independent local nonprofit that used to be known as the Alzheimer's Association Capital of Texas chapter. They have been a privately funded voluntary health organization since 1982, serving Central Texans with Alzheimer's disease and their caregivers. About 3 or 4 years ago, Alzheimer's Texas broke away to form their own nonprofit and decided to focus 100% of their funds and efforts here in Central Texas. However, Alzheimer's Texas maintains the same level of commitment, providing support, education, and advocacy for those affected by Alzheimer's in our community. Currently, Alzheimer's Texas reaches about 12 to 16 counties, though I will say the pandemic has allowed them to reach a broader population in Texas through a virtual platform. We would have preferred, of course, to avoid the pandemic and never go through all this, but we are thankful that we can reach a broader platform through virtual presentations and education. Alzheimer's Texas continues to carry out its vital mission to eliminate Alzheimer's disease and related disorders through the advancement of research and to enhance care and support for individuals, their families, and caregivers. I always tell my gerontology students that Alzheimer's and other dementias are an increasingly urgent public health issue and one of the most significant health crises of our lifetime, especially as the baby boomers are aging and life expectancy is increasing. 1 in 9 people over 65 and nearly 50% of people over 85 have a form of dementia. Many people will live with these diseases for longer, creating unprecedented demands on our society, and on our healthcare system. So this is why conversations like we're having today are so important as we mutually support one another as we face this disease. So as any good academic, I would like to provide some learning objectives. We want to better understand common mood and behavioral symptoms associated with Alzheimer's disease. We want to learn about a practical approach to effectively coping with Alzheimer's disease, mood and behavioral symptoms, and learn about other evidence-based strategies to treat these symptoms. And so I really, again, invite you to share your experiences, your expertise and input throughout the presentation. So it's important to start out by naming the most common psychological and behavioral symptoms seen in folks experiencing Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. Unfortunately, it can be a long list. Though we know that not all folks with Alzheimer's experience these symptoms, and every person experiences various psychological and behavioral symptoms differently. For example, I worked with a woman in a skilled nursing facility who wandered and was experiencing the delusion that she was pregnant and about to give birth every day. Knowing specific skills to redirect and support her was a vital part of her care. And we will touch on those basic skills today. I imagine these symptoms are very common to those of you here today or familiar to you. Research tells us that over 80% of patients with Alzheimer's disease over the course of their disease are affected by these symptoms. However, the ways these symptoms present varies greatly between patients and over an individual's disease course. So we know that these symptoms can look very different from person to person. So why do these symptoms occur? While I think most, if not all people in this group understand the basic causes of these symptoms, it can be helpful for us to have easily understood and accessible language to use when we are speaking with friends, caregivers, and community members who might be less familiar with this diagnosis. We know that at a very basic neurological level, nerve cells are dying in the brain, leading to plaques and tangles, but the exact mood and behavioral changes we see in each person impacted varies greatly, depending on which part of the brain is most impacted by the loss of nerve cells. For example, the frontal lobes are the area of the brain right behind the eyes that control our ability to focus, pay attention, be motivated, regulate impulses, and other aspects of personality. When cells in the frontal lobe of the brain are lost, some people are less able to plan, less able to stay focused, less motivated, and may become more passive. Or someone with frontal lobe deficits may act rudely or insensitively. We also know that there are other physiological causes for mood and behavioral changes. It can make it difficult for caregivers to discern whether they are seeing symptoms related to Alzheimer's or a separate or related physiological process that is exacerbating symptoms. For example, we know that pain, infection, metabolic changes, medication side effects, and other health changes can all exacerbate or produce an onset of mood or behavioral symptoms in folks with memory loss or Alzheimer's disease. Later, we will go over some strategies for collecting data on these symptoms so you can consult with the person's primary care physician or other healthcare professional about those changes as you see them. As we know, there are often secondary or environmental causes for mood or behavioral symptoms in folks with Alzheimer's. While the physiological state puts them at risk for these symptoms, the environmental factors can trigger the symptoms. I'm sure many of you are familiar with what these causes look like for those battling Alzheimer's. We know that loud noises, unfamiliar surroundings, or physical discomfort that they can't explain to someone are all triggers for mood and behavioral changes. And how are patients and caregivers impacted? Well, you could probably tell me better than I can tell you in many ways. I really want to recognize that you are on the front lines of caregiving for those impacted by this disease. I think it's important to take a moment to recognize and validate the impact these symptoms have on both the person with Alzheimer's and their caregivers. As you see here, recent research shows that disruptive behaviors have an adverse impact on the emotional connection between the caregiver and the care recipient, and they exacerbate difficulties in other domains, such as caring for activities of daily living. Other recent studies show that anywhere from 34 to 55% of caregivers experience mental health symptoms, which are only made worse by the presence of mood and behavioral challenges. So we know that the negative impact of these symptoms on both the person with the disease and their caregiver is very real and significant. So today I want to start out by focusing on some practical strategies that caregivers can utilize to manage the challenging mood and behavioral symptoms often seen with Alzheimer's disease. Many of you use some or all of these strategies, and you might know them well, but there might be some steps on this list that are newer or less familiar to you. If you are an experienced caregiver or practitioner who supports caregivers, you might think about how you can use this list to enhance your work or empower those you serve. Later in the presentation, we will also go over some of the most current evidence-based therapeutic interventions for Alzheimer's mood and behavioral symptoms. But for now, I want to start out with these practical strategies that can help caregivers address day-to-day challenges as they arise. So this specific list is from Paula Spencer Scott's book, Surviving Alzheimer's, Practical Tips and Soul-Saving Wisdom for Caregivers. And some of you might have read this book or be familiar with it. There are many guides out there that have similar steps, but I like the holistic nature of this list as it focuses on both the person with the disease and the experience of the caregiver. I also want to be clear that these steps don't have to be completed in any specific order, though some of them are often the first steps, such as reassuring the person and redirecting their behavior or attention. All right, let me back up here. All right, so the first step is really reassuring the person. This is one that I'm sure many of you use frequently and regularly. It is really one of the most important steps you can take in that it shows the person that you are there to support them. As soon as you notice an adverse or negative mood or behavioral shift, it's helpful to provide reassurance as soon as possible. This reassurance can often de-escalate frustration that is building for the person and prevent a larger emotional or behavioral response from happening. As we all know, we must be self-regulated to support the self-regulation for someone else. This is why it's so important to calm ourselves before we engage in this process of reassurance for someone else. It could look like taking a couple of deep breaths or a few seconds of mindfulness where you check in with your own feelings or physical state. It's important to be aware if you're hungry or tired and pace yourself accordingly as you begin to address the symptoms exhibited by the person with the disease. It's also very important to be aware of your body language, your posture, and your facial expressions. It's easy to get busy and multitask while we're caregiving. We might end up speaking to someone from the side or standing behind them while we're preparing food or folding clothes. However, we want to be easily visible to the person who is experiencing emotional or behavioral distress, especially when we are speaking to them. And I used to be able to crouch down when I was younger in skilled nursing facilities. I now need a chair for that in my 40s, and that's fine. But it's really important to be at eye level. It's also important to avoid sudden or erratic movements, and it's best to make eye contact and be at eye level again with someone, as I mentioned. As most of you know, arguing a point or reacting with logic rarely serves a purpose when trying to effectively communicate with someone who has Alzheimer's disease, especially someone in the later stages. In fact, we know it can exacerbate their experiences of frustration anger, anxiety, and so forth. Rather, we want to respond to and validate the emotion being expressed with statements such as, I know this must be so frustrating, or it sounds like that was scary. And finally, we want to take time to connect with what they are feeling and saying, and then remind the person that they are safe and that you are there to support them. Many times, just this step alone can go a long way towards diffusing the symptoms and helping the person recover from the experience. Then we want to review the possible causes. When we think about determining both short-term and long-term interventions, it's very important to review the possible causes for the mood or behavioral challenges. It's helpful to consider such factors as the timing, whether there might be a pattern to when and where the person's behaviors are occurring, anything new or different that might have upset the person, and any potential unmet needs, such as hunger, pain management, thirst, overstimulation, or simply feeling unsafe. As we know, something as simple as a loud trash truck that comes by the person's window could be a trigger. We might only see the person visibly anxious and unable to tell us what happened. It's also important to assess the person's body language. Are they gesturing towards something? Are they holding their head as if to hide or possibly from a headache? Their body language can give you clues about follow-up questions you could ask that can help you identify the root of the problem, such as, are you hurting? Do you have a headache? We want to also consider anything that might have happened before the behavior or response. For example, be aware of how you reacted before or after the response. Were you visibly upset by something, or were you visibly upset by their distress, which might have heightened their distress? And finally, ask the person questions that show that you're on their side and to help you better understand the problem. You can use phrases such as, I'm so sorry this happened. I definitely want to help. Can you tell me why you're feeling sad? Of course, we know sometimes they're not able to tell us, and sometimes they are, but it's helpful to try by asking. Of course, once we have a better idea of the causes or triggers, then we can work on removing them. These are some of the various types of triggers that can cause mood or behavioral symptoms for people with Alzheimer's disease. I'm sure you are familiar with many of these. Something as simple as car keys or a coat by the door could create a desire to wander off. As I mentioned earlier, loud noises can be distressing. Even something as simple as preparing a meal or a lawnmower outside could cause distress for someone with Alzheimer's. Paying attention to lighting is also important, since shadows or dark areas could be anxiety-provoking. Be aware of who is coming or going in the space. That's a really important step as well, since even familiar faces could be seen as strangers. I mentioned earlier how hunger or being too hot or cold can cause a mood or behavioral response. And then finally, frustration triggers are important to be aware of. These are scenarios that cause the person to feel invalidated because they can't act in some way, such as the person who wants to do some handiwork with their tools, even though we know it would not be safe for them to do so. A validating narrative helps address their wish or need and gently redirects them, such as the example you see here. We stored your tools in the garage so they wouldn't get rained on. And I'm sure many of you have used similar techniques in your work. And then we want, of course, to redirect the behavior or attention. Redirecting the person's behavior is an essential part of addressing mood or behavioral symptoms. One of the most important steps we can take in redirecting someone who is confused is to validate the feeling they are experiencing, as I mentioned before. We want to support the person in moving on to a more positive experience in their day. To support this shift away from the frustrating trigger, it's helpful to provide options, such as, would you like some water or a snack? or a change of scenery by offering to sit on the patio for some fresh air if it's not 100 degrees like it is right now. If someone has a lot of psychomotor agitation, meaning they wish to move around a lot, we can ask for help with more physical tasks that are safe and peaceful, such as watering flowers or possibly folding laundry if someone enjoys doing that. It's important to propose activities the person enjoys and would be interested in doing. This is where a thorough assessment of the person's social history can be very useful. Do they like gardening? Or do they have a favorite TV show that they never missed? These can be very helpful pieces of information as you think about how to redirect someone. Bridge phrases are also very helpful tools. And I'll give you an example. You might say, I know those sounds outside are terrible. Would you like to move into the living room where it's quieter and you can tell me more about being a teacher? So these are phrases that kind of help us transition someone into a different environment and away from the distressing experience. Of course, all of us probably know how effective and therapeutic reminiscence can be for people with dementia, and for all of us, really. In my work with people with dementia who were hospitalized for psychiatric emergencies, reminiscence was one of the most effective ways to redirect them and help them self-soothe. They could tell a story that was special and meaningful, which also helped me learn more about them as a person and tailor my approaches to their needs. It can also be helpful to break down tasks into simple, manageable steps and assign tasks that have an element of choice. For example, if you're making a flower arrangement with someone who has dementia, you can ask them to put in one flower at a time and let them choose the color. If you end up with 10 red flowers and one yellow flower, then so be it. That's a lovely bouquet as well. And research shows us that exercise is one of the best stress relievers, of course. Many of us know this and use it for ourselves. If the person is able, taking a walk or doing simple stretches in their wheelchair can make a big difference in their mood and in the caregiver's mood as well. Getting outside can also be therapeutic and calming, as long as it's not too hot or cold again. We also know that music or interacting with a pet can be excellent interventions for mood and behavioral symptoms. In all of my years working in skilled nursing facilities and assisted livings, I saw firsthand the therapeutic impact of music and pet therapies. Someone could be anxious one minute and then dancing to Aretha Franklin or snuggling with a puppy the next minute. It's truly amazing to see this, and I know many of you have probably seen similar results. The rest of these approaches are likely familiar to you. It's important to speak slowly and calmly and to avoid quick movements. Sometimes moving to a quieter area can also be helpful. We want to give brief, simple directions, ask simple close-ended questions, and say one thing at a time. I always tell my social work students, don't stack your questions. Don't ask someone, are you cold? Would you like a blanket? Are you hungry? It's hard for folks with dementia to answer all those questions. They might just be overwhelmed by them. And then finally, it's really important to pause or back off if an approach isn't working, and try your best to keep a daily routine to help increase a sense of predictability for the person, keeping in mind that life happens and we can't plan out every day, even when we try really hard to do so. So this is a really important step that is often overlooked. It's very, very important when possible to restore yourself if you are the caregiver, or support the caregiver to restore themselves when they are handling mood and behavioral challenges. It's important for caregivers to give themselves a moment for deep breathing and mindfulness, to check in with their thoughts and their feelings and their needs. I know there isn't always time in the middle of a behavioral challenge to do this. There often isn't any time, but it's important for caregivers to do this at some point, especially if they have faced many behavioral issues with the person they are caring for. Practicing self-compassion and giving yourself credit as a caregiver are essential steps. We are not perfect. None of us are, right? And not all approaches we try will be effective. There are going to be those hard days. And we want to celebrate what is working well and recognize the barriers to success that made it difficult for us as a caregiver. If you had a good walk and the person feels better, celebrate that moment. We had a nice walk outside and that went really well. You want to take a break when possible. And again, I know it's often not possible initially, but it's really important to take a break whenever you can and allow time to de-stress. Having something to look forward to is important, such as watching your favorite show in the evening or spending time with a friend when you can. These steps can make all the difference in caregivers' mental health and coping. Of course, access to respite care and your social support system is essential. Knowing who to call when you need support and help is really a vital piece of information for you to have. Some of you here today are the helpers that people call, but it's important for you to have support for yourself as well. What happens on the day when you're overwhelmed as the helper, of the caregiver? How do you take care of yourself? And then make sure your basic needs are met as well. Did you have lunch? Did you take your own medication, right? These are really important pieces of restoring yourself. And then we want to review what happened. This is another helpful step for caregivers. Again, when we're able, we can't always review in the moment, but it's really important when we can to do this. We know, again, there's not always time, but when we can, we want to make a written or electronic record of the incident. And it's possible, if possible, note the time, date, severity, and any important details regarding the incident that will help you describe it to others, such as a primary care physician or home health nurse. I have included a link here today on the slide to a journaling app that you can get on your phone, download to your phone. This is just one of many applications that can help you quickly and easily log mood and behavioral symptoms. Some, like me, prefer the old-fashioned pen and paper method, which is also a great tool as long as you don't lose it, like I have been known to do at times. And then consider any changes to the usual routine or changes to medication that might have led to the symptoms. Consider what other symptoms were present, such as increased lethargy, physical agitation, upset stomach, or any other symptoms you might have noticed. If others were present when the symptoms occurred, such as a home health nurse or family member, ask for a description of what they saw. Our memories can be and often are flawed, and we might not see every detail of what occurred. Someone else could have witnessed what happened before you observed the symptoms. Consider the fact that you might not have all of the information and that someone else could help fill in the gaps. And then finally, we want to reach out for more help. We know no one can navigate the complex challenges of Alzheimer's caregiving alone. And we mean no one, right? As we mentioned before, it's important to consult with other personal or professional caregivers involved in the person's care. Have they noticed an overall change or decline in the person's condition? When we are caring for someone every day, it can be harder to notice these subtle changes or declines in their condition, and consulting with others who are involved in the care can be helpful and informative. If the symptoms persist, we want to schedule an appointment with the person's primary care physician. We know that conditions such as a urinary tract infection or metabolic imbalances could exacerbate these symptoms, and further diagnostic testing is often needed to rule out these causes. The rest of these steps are ones that many of you support in your current roles, such as joining a virtual community for dementia caregivers, staying involved with a local Alzheimer's group, such as Alzheimer's Texas, consulting with dementia care experts, taking workshops, and staying up to date on the latest books and research that's out there. So I hope those practical steps will be useful for you in your work as a caregiver or respite care provider or support group facilitator. For the remaining time we have left, I would like to shift over and provide a brief overview of non-pharmacological interventions for Alzheimer's mood and behavioral symptoms. I know some of you here today have a professional background in mental health, nursing, or other related fields, and may be familiar with some or all of these approaches. I'm hopeful that this overview will help everyone think about how they can further support those living with Alzheimer's, either through referrals to agencies or practitioners who provide these services, or by providing them yourselves. So these interventions can be broken down into 3 categories that you see here, including sensory stimulation, cognitive emotional oriented, and other evidence-based interventions. And I'll take a few minutes to go over the various interventions in each of these categories. All right, so we have sensory stimulation interventions. Many of these will be familiar to you, while others may be less familiar. Research shows us that traditional Eastern interventions, such as shiatsu and acupuncture, can be helpful in addressing mood and behavioral symptoms for people with dementia. Of course, this intervention is only effective for people who are willing and able to undergo these treatments, which is also true for most, if not all, of the sensory stimulation interventions. Aromatherapy has been used to treat a wide range of health problems, including lack of sleep, anxiety, and behavioral symptoms for people with dementia. Aromatherapy is a versatile intervention in that it is widely accessible in stores and online, and it can be delivered through massage, topical application, inhalation, and water immersion. I have seen caregivers simply keep an aromatherapy diffuser running in a person's room, providing a comforting and familiar scent each day. I actually keep one running in my own room and really enjoy that myself. And then massage and touch therapy have been proposed by many researchers as an effective non-pharmacological intervention to offset the manifestation of cognitive decline and behavioral disturbance. Any of us who regularly utilize massage for our own mental and physical health can attest to its restorative impact. So it makes sense that people with dementia can also benefit greatly from this intervention if the experience is not distressing or physically prohibitive due to other health conditions. And then light therapy is an intervention that I have recently learned more about. You can see a picture here of a woman enjoying the soft light while reading. Our circadian rhythms are controlled by the hypothalamus section of the brain, and degenerative changes in the hypothalamus can cause circadian rhythm disturbances in people with dementia. So evidence suggests that circadian rhythm disturbance can be reversed, at least somewhat, by stimulation of the hypothalamus with light. Research results are mixed about whether this intervention is actually effective for reducing dementia-related mood and behavioral symptoms. However, studies suggest that it cannot hurt, and it might provide some relief around the sleep disturbances many people with dementia experience because of their sleep-wake patterns being reversed. And then we have the sensory garden and horticulture activities that use various aspects of gardens to stimulate the 5 senses, or they use plants and plant-related activities to improve an overall sense of well-being. And here's a picture of what a sensory garden might look like. Research shows mild to moderate decreases in verbal and physical aggression and nonverbal aggression when these activities are implemented. We see this approach in use in many assisted livings and skilled nursing facility settings as well. And then music therapy, as you probably know, is the application of music and its elements with melody, rhythm, harmony, and sound by a qualified musical therapist in order to support and stimulate various aspects of cognitive, emotional, social, and physical needs. Music therapy has been shown to be effective in reducing behavioral symptoms, including physical and verbal aggressive behavior. Studies around the effectiveness of dance therapy are less conclusive, though we know that dance can be a form of exercise, which has been shown to be effective in improving mood and behavioral functioning. Of course, we see these interventions widely used in many settings, such as community centers, respite care programs, assisted livings, and so forth. Studies have also shown that art therapy activities can help boost cognitive function in various areas of the brain and enhance communication, brain function, and social interaction in people with dementia. I have seen this firsthand in the skilled nursing setting through various art and theater focused activities. And I'll end our presentation today by sharing one example that I hope will be inspirational, because as any good social worker, I have to leave you with inspiration. Can't leave you with sadness. And then the Snoozelen or Snoozelen, I probably am mispronouncing it, but I'm trying to do my best. Snoozelen multisensory stimulation therapy was developed in the Netherlands in the 1970s by John Holsegi and Odd Verhoel. It's more commonly used in Germany and across Europe, though some settings in the US use pieces of this strategy or intervention. And so for those of you who are less familiar, this intervention comprises multiple stimuli and is aimed at stimulating the primary senses of sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. This intervention is provided in specifically designed rooms, which provide diverse sensory stimulating effects and materials, including music, aroma, bubble tubes, fiber optic sprays, and moving shapes projected across walls. Simply put, these rooms might remind you of a party room. That's kind of how they that's what they remind me of. Initial studies regarding this intervention show that it can be effective. It's an effective short-term intervention for increasing a person's experience of joy and reducing boredom and inactivity. But potential long-term benefits of this intervention still need to be researched and explored. And of course, we know that this wouldn't be effective for all people experiencing dementia. It could also be distressing for some people who might be overstimulated by such a experience. And I'll show you here some pictures. This is a woman in a Snoozelen sensory room, and there are the fiber optic sprays, and she seems to be happy and enjoying those. And then here's a room where you can see all of the lights and the sensory stimulation materials that are in that room. And so that's what they traditionally look like. And then this is just a picture of some folks enjoying music and dance therapy. And we know, again, how helpful and effective that can be. So I wanted to give you all some examples there. All right, so I'm going to move on to cognitive emotion-oriented interventions. I am not going to spend a lot of time today on these interventions because you could have whole day trainings on any of these interventions. There is an article in the reference list for this presentation that provides some introductory information and references for those who wish to read more and learn more about these interventions. However, I'll touch on some of the more commonly utilized approaches, some of which you are probably already utilizing, even if you might not know it. All right, so cognitive stimulation involves a variety of pleasurable activities such as word games, puzzles, music, cooking, gardening, and discussing past and present events as the person is able, of course. These activities are usually carried out by trained professionals or volunteers like many of you. This intervention has been shown in many studies to reduce the incidence of behavioral disturbance in people with dementia. So this is a very commonly used approach. Another commonly used approach, of course, is reminiscence and life review. Is very widely utilized by in many settings, both formally and informally, to support people with dementia. This intentional discussion of past experiences, events, and activities often involves the use of photographs, books, newspapers, and familiar items to jog the memory and encourage the sharing of stories. I will share a story myself of one time when I was leading a reminiscence group in an assisted living, and a gentleman abruptly got up and walked away. I thought he must have been incredibly bored by my facilitation. A few minutes later, he returned with a dried cotton plant and an entire scrapbook of pictures from his career as a farmer. He began to share his experiences with the rest of the group, and it was an incredible experience to watch the group mutually share with him. So that's my message about not giving up, even when it seems like what you're doing is not going well. Keep at it, because you never know how it's going to go. I'm sure you have seen similar scenarios as well. And this intervention, of course, has been shown to improve depression, communication, positive mood, cognition, well-being, and social engagement. So this is really a go-to intervention for many of us working in the field. Validation therapy is also a commonly used approach, both formally and informally. This approach involves acceptance of the reality and personal truth of another person's experience and the world that they believe they're living in. Validation therapy techniques comprise of non-threatening, simple, concrete words, speaking in a clear, low, and empathic tone of voice, and rephrasing, paraphrasing, and mirroring unclear verbal communication. Simply put, it involves communicating with people who have dementia in a way that acknowledges their words and actions with respect and empathy, rather than with embarrassment, anger, or dismissiveness. For example, if someone with dementia says, "The ball is light," I might respond by asking, "Do you see a ball of light?" This approach has been found in studies to help decrease behavioral problems and depression. And then finally, there are a wide range of behavior management techniques that can be used to help address mood and behavioral challenges experienced by people with dementia. We won't go over all of them today, but what I will say is that all of these approaches involve some form of operant conditioning or reinforcing the desired behavior with the hope of decreasing the challenging behavior or symptoms. Of course, a trained professional would need to select and tailor these interventions to the individual person's psychological needs and where they are in the disease process. It can be helpful to work with a dementia specialist, social worker, or psychologist when developing a behavior management plan for someone with Alzheimer's disease. While studies are mixed about on whether these behavioral management techniques are ultimately effective in reducing mood or behavioral symptoms, some studies show that they can help reduce behavioral problems in some people experiencing dementia. So it's really just about each individual and whether or not they would benefit from a behavior management plan. And then finally, these are just a few other evidence-based approaches, and we've touched on a couple of these. While studies examining the efficacy of exercise therapy are somewhat mixed in terms of how much this intervention reduces behavioral symptoms, it has been shown to improve overall cognition and activity of daily living function. These improvements can contribute to a better overall quality of life and could ultimately impact mood and behavioral function as well. And then animal-assisted therapy is also widely used for people with dementia. Studies consistently show this intervention can help reduce agitation and increase social behavior for people with dementia. I have seen amazing responses to animals from people living with dementia, including people who are unable to speak. I'm sure you have seen similar results as well. And then last but not least, tailored dining room environment approaches are fairly new as a formal intervention, though many settings such as skilled nursing facilities and assisted livings have drawn on this concept for decades. This approach involves improving the lighting and the table setting contrast in the dining room. And these two steps have been shown to reduce problematic behaviors in the dining room, including agitation. So there's some really interesting research out about that as well. So I promised an inspirational story to wrap up. And as you can tell, this is me and some other wonderful skilled nursing facility employees, including our administrator, who was so kind to wear a red wig on his head. I was a bit younger here, as you can tell. So this is us dressed up for Halloween and just having fun and trying to really make the environment a happy place to be in. But the story I want to tell you is that our activities director approached me and she said, hey, you know, would you mind if your interns, because I always had interns from the University of Texas, and she said, do you mind if your interns join us in the activities department, because we'd like to develop a play. And I thought, well, that sounds complicated since most of our residents have some form of dementia, but she was determined. And so I said, sure, let's have the interns help you with this. So over the course of about 6 weeks, they met with several, probably 8 to 10 residents, and they wrote a play called The Royal Papers. And it was a really funny play, as a comedy about, figuring out what the royal papers are. What are the royal papers, right? And many of the participants had dementia. And it was incredible to see how, with the right support, they could perform in a play. And they did just that. And we had a packed house of family members and neighbors and community members, and everyone was in tears, because it was just such a beautiful thing to see that folks with dementia and other health challenges, alive and in a play and performing in front of their loved ones. We don't have time today to watch this little clip because I want to get to questions and answers, but this will be available on the Alzheimer's Texas website. And I encourage you to watch this little clip. It's just 2.5 minutes. It won't take much of your time, but you'll hear from residents who were in the play, and they'll tell you how they felt about it and how it impacted their lives. So there's your inspirational story for today. I want to just remind you, I'm going to turn my video back on here, about all of the services that Alzheimer's Texas has to offer. And we invite you to think about the ways that we can continue to contribute to the work that you're doing and the needs that you have in your role. Of course, the pandemic has made and continues to make this work challenging for all of us. And it's hard for us to fully engage in our roles, but Alzheimer's Texas wants to know how we can support you and how we can problem solve through this difficult time. I want to remind everyone that Alzheimer's Texas is available for personalized consultations to help caregivers and community partners problem solve and cope with challenges. So we welcome you to really use that resource. We are here for you. And then we want to open it up for questions and what you want us to know.